So anyhow, and continuing on the trend of Democratic incompetence and corruption. This is a story in Jacobin about Mayor Pete. I always butcher his last name. You guys, is it Buttigieg or Buttigieg or I always just call him Mayor Pete because I can't fucking pronounce his name. This is Jacobin. This is by Julia Rock and Andrew Perez. Mayor Pete is not disclosing his dark money donors. After his failed 2020 presidential campaign, Pete Buttigieg started a dark money group. It hasn't disclosed its donors as promised. A political advocacy group launched by Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg was bankrolled by at least 7 six-figure dark money donations in 2020, according to new documents reviewed by us. The new disclosure reveals the extent to which Buttigieg's, oh boy, that's fun, add the S onto it, post-presidential campaign journey was financed by wealthy donors. Because the donors have not been publicly disclosed, it's impossible to assess whether they may have interests in matters related to the transportation department he now leads, or in the large new pool of infrastructure funds he gets to oversee. So just quickly before we carry on here, you guys, Pete is going to have a lot of say over how the infrastructure bill is administered. So those funds that were approved by Congress, last spring, to go to infrastructure, or last summer, whenever it was, to go to infrastructure, now the transportation secretary is going to have quite a bit of say over how to direct those funds. So firms who might want one of those nice fat government contracts may have every reason in the world to now donate to this dark money group that Pete was a part of and is still very closely connected to. So there's two angles here. It could be corruption for government contracts because he's the transportation secretary during an infrastructure program. It also could be that they view him as, with what we were just talking about, with Biden and Harris tanking in their favorabilities. It may very well be that Democrats and insiders are starting to look at Pete as somebody who they could run in 2024, should Biden and Harris be unviable. So there's two possible corruption angles pertaining to this dark group, and this dark group is refusing to disclose its donors as it promised it would. Where was I here? After dropping out of the 2020 Democratic primary, Pete Buttigieg formed a political action committee called Win the Era, as well as social welfare nonprofit called Win the Era Action Fund, which has funneled $1.9 million to the PAC since 2020 to use its email list and pay for some administrative costs. While the nonprofit suggested last year it would start voluntarily disclosing its donors, it has not yet done so. According to Win the Era Action Fund's first tax return obtained by us, the dark money group raised $2.1 million in 2020. The group raised $870,000, or roughly 40% of that haul, from donors who gave at least 6 figures. The biggest donor gave $250,000, another gave $120,000, and 5 other contributors each gave $100,000. As we previously reported, Mayor Pete wrote in his cabinet ethics pledge that he would not participate in any matter involving Win the Era, but he made no such pledge to recuse from matters involving big donors to the organization. This is critical, you guys. They make it appear as though there has been a separation between Pete and this dark money group, when obviously that's just a formality, right? I mean, if you believe this, you have no idea how the swamp of Washington, D.C. works. In April last year, Business Insider reported that the Win the Era Action Fund would pivot to focus on issues including climate change, economic justice, democracy reform, mental health, and national service. The report added that the organization plans to voluntarily disclose names of donors over $250. That is what they have now reneged on. Upon his nomination to serve as Transportation Secretary of Transportation in December 2020, Pete resigned from his affiliation with Win the Era effectively immediately. That's weird wording, a spokesperson for the group told us. Since then, Swati Mailavarapu, has served as president and board chair for Win the Era. Mailavarapu, a Silicon Valley Democratic fundraiser, served as the national finance chair for Pete's presidential campaign. There's your connection, guys. If you believe that he is actually now somehow not connected to this group, you're out to fucking lunch. Their website had continued to say, after Pete, quote unquote, formally separated from this group, they continued to have on their website support for Pete as a politician. So the idea that these groups are separate is, I mean, if you're that naive, I got a bridge in Brooklyn to sell you and Gullables written on your fucking ceiling. This is clearly either a venture to sort of opportunistically utilize Pete's likely 2024 campaign, or it's a corrupt venture to utilize Pete's power as Secretary of Transportation and to serve big businesses who may be interested in government contracts that come from that infrastructure bill. So great reporting there from Jacobin. Unsurprising to see Mayor Pete getting involved with these big money donors who refuse to disclose themselves. And this is just kind of business as usual in DC, but it is an indication that Pete is serious about running for president in 2024. And he clearly, outside of the possibility that a progressive would run, he has a pretty clear path, right? I mean, if Biden wants to run again, it's going to be very difficult for anybody to primary him, whether it's a progressive or a corporate Democrat. But if Biden doesn't want to run or can't run, then I think Pete would have a really good chance of usurping Kamala Harris because of how horrendously she has performed as vice president and how low her polling currently sits. So this is an indication that Pete is interested and that big donors are interested in supporting Pete. And that's not great news for progressives, is it? Although, again, I'm not naive enough to expect that we would ever have a prayer in a Democratic primary, considering that they openly rig them. But anyhow, worth covering here. Great work from Jacobin to expose the corruption and the lack of transparency from these big money donors who are supporting Mayor Pete and are likely to reap millions or billions of dollars in benefits from those infrastructure contracts.